So welcome everyone who is zooming in and in person. We're here talking with Dennis Hogan, who's visiting to talk to us in our series on labor in higher education, sponsored by TAUP and the Adjunct Constituency Council. He's going to talk to us about the crisis in higher education, his experiences as both an organizer and a writer, and yeah, we're going to have a conversation. So you want to say something to introduce yourself?
So first of all, thank you all for coming and spending your Friday afternoon with me. It's very kind of you, and for the invitation. You know, it's really it's always nice to be like noticed for one's work, but obviously the greatest contribution that you can make to the movement is to help other people win their fights. And so to the extent that I can be a part of whatever fight you all are part of, I want to do that and help in that way. So yeah, so I mean, I can really briefly sort of tell my little story and talk about some of the issues I've been thinking through. And then I know that some of you have prepared questions based on previous stuff I've done. I'm happy to answer them and think through them together as much as possible, and then also talk about, I want to learn as much as I can about Temple and what you all are going through and what things are like here, because it's a case that I'm definitely less familiar with, having not spent a ton of time here. So I'm newly back in Philadelphia. I lived here until 2012, and then I left. My wife went to law school, I went to grad school, and we always were we'll come back here someday. And we never expected that it would take 11 years, but we finally made it. So I did my PhD in comparative literature, and I work on 19th century Central America, which is not necessarily doesn't necessarily lend itself to critical study of contemporary US higher education. But as somebody in the humanities who had gone to relatively well-resourced schools, I was always curious about why it was that there never seemed to be any money for the stuff that I cared about, when there seemed to be so much money in general, right? And so that combined with my commitment to labor politics led me to doing union organizing work at Brown, where I went to grad school. But it also led me to the the study of the actual way that the university operates, right, on a basic level. So I got appointed to the University Resources Committee, which is a committee that sets the university budget at Brown, which there is $780 million or whatever. So I was oh great, I'm gonna finally be in the room where these decisions get made. I'm going to be on a committee that's looking at the budget and stuff. And what I realized almost immediately was that was not the room, right, where the decisions got made. There was a different room that nobody else was allowed. And the University Resources Committee was one of these things where it was it was the provost who we had at the time. It was one of his signature committees. It was the one he was most proud of, because to him it demonstrated how the budget was set collaboratively by the community with representatives from all the parties, faculty, staff, students at every level, and that what was ultimately produced was a document that reflected not only our resources but also our values and our priorities, and blah 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 blah. And so first of all, what we ended up doing was every year there was a budget surplus, except in the years when there was a budget deficit, and our job was to figure out what to do with it. So, the budget from last year would just roll over, and then there'd be $12 million. And there'd be $40 million of requests, right? Everything from lead pipe remediation in, the underwater basket weaving building, to establishing a new postdoctoral fellowship for underwater basket weavers. And you'd have to decide, right, what are we going to spend our $12 million on when we have $40 million requests? And the years when there were budget deficits, you'd be all right, what are we cutting? We have to cut $8 million, so we're going to cut. And it was really a way, I realized, of democratizing responsibility for difficult choices, right? That choices that were often made behind closed doors, right? So it was a way of saying, okay, well, we're gonna set the parameters and offer you a very small amount of wiggle room to play within those parameters. But then ultimately, this entire budget, whether you like it, whether you hate it, whatever, is going to be stamped with this was passed by committee, and so therefore, right, the process was good. And so, yeah, that was, I tell the story a lot because that was a moment where I was really like, okay, so like, we're dealing with, like, I had known sort of that like we needed to have a sense of like how the budget works and where the money comes from and where it goes, and you know, because if we're ever going to be able to credibly claim that like we deserve more of it, for example, right, which we all do. But what that made me really realize is that there is like when you think about like what management is, right, like administration, we always encounter sort of like the business end of that. But like what it really is like these institutions are incredibly complicated. They have millions of moving parts. And so like the more complicated they become, the more administration proliferates because you need people whose job it is just to make sure that parts are moving correctly. But that presents a challenge, right, to folks like us who want to exercise more control over the priorities of the institution, right? Because all of these decisions are being made in a technocratic way, by bean counters who don't actually, and often in many cases, don't even have the authority to set policy, right? Like they're just bureaucrats and functionaries who are just downstream from decisions that are being made way above their heads. And so, you know, that kind of led me to realizing that part of what we have is like I talk about as like a crisis of governance, right? Where the governance of these universities is really technocratic, and the space for like really democratic decision making is so narrowed and so eviscerated that we get like that it's functionally not. There's functionally very little democracy. And yet, you know, we are constantly forced to channel our energies into these spaces, right? Like to sit on committees, to go through this labor, you know, and I'm not the kind of person who's like, oh, you know, like it's so like sitting through a boring committee meeting is not the same as like doing really difficult physical labor, right? But like it is designed to trap you in cul-de-sacs. Right. And so like ultimately I do think that like labor organizing, broad-based organizing, majoritarian organizing is the way that you like break through, right? Those roadblocks and those cul-de-sacs. I guess I'll just say like I have been thinking a lot recently about what kinds of struggles or what kind of organizing really make it possible to achieve like lasting institutional change. And we unionized Brown grad students in 2018. We were the first Ivy League school to have like a graduate student union. And one of the first private schools, period, because that was this was during the Trump years when it wasn't clear if that was even going to be allowed. And then since then, you know, there's been this wave of like massive labor activism. And not just in private schools, right? Although a lot of the victories have been there in new organizing, but also, right, like I think the largest union election last year was with student researchers at the University of California, in all the United States, and that was or maybe it was 2022, yeah, last year still, getting close, and so there's been this like real wave that's washed over the industry. But I also think, you know, we are in this sort of period where it's like, okay, well, like, what are we going to do now, right? Like now that we have really broad support for unionization, right? It used to be good to convince people they were even workers, right? And now I think that is more a commonsensical notion, right? Including among academics. And you know, for contingent, adjunct, and non-tenure track faculty, it's hard to have any illusions about what your relationship is to the institution, right? The like absolute disposability with which like faculty in general, but especially like non-tenure track, adjunct and continuing faculty are treated, the extent to which it's just I don't even know what to say. It's like a cruel, insane, and humiliating way to treat people that shouldn't be allowed and isn't allowed in real jobs. Like, I'm sorry to say it, but like in normal workplaces, there's a lot, you know, you don't have summers off or whatever. There's a lot of other different bullshit, but it's not that humiliating, right? Like, you're not constantly begging for someone to treat you like a human being. At least in the professional, right? In white collar workplaces, like the kind that we would probably be in if we weren't in the academy. So yeah, so I think that's sort of like the question right now, right? It's like, okay, so we're organizing, we're getting denser, but we're still not at the point where we're really exercising hegemony over these institutions, right? Like they're still beating us, we're still losing, even though we're stronger than we were. And you know, the other piece of this that I think is really important is the ways that these really scary right-wing attacks on higher education all over the country, you know, especially in red states, but all over the country, are now being weaponized to persecute faculty and students. And administrators, for the most part, are either scared to go against them or find them to be convenient, right? Because they align with some piece of their existing agenda. And so, you know, we have on the one hand, like this behemoth, these university behemoths that like treat people as completely disposable and want to just like grind you down. On the other hand, you have these like right-wing culture war fanatics who think that college period is bad, but like to the extent that we should have college, it should be like, you know, job training for Lockheed Martin or whatever, or like for Christian, like holy war. And then we also have this sort of like
that position I hadn't thought of.
Yeah. Holy warrior, yeah. And then we also have, right, we have students that are indebted and communities that are being increasingly displaced, right, and treated as disposable, because ultimately, like what these institutions do. And I'm not one of these people, you know, there's these people who are like, oh well, burn it down, like we hate college, they'll never love you back, blah blah. And like I often find that, like, not to overgeneralize, but those are often people who are in positions of relative comfort, like within the academy, like who are able to convince themselves that they've like divested from it. But you know, in my experience, there's no fiercer advocates for the promise and the potential of higher education than the people who are fighting to just keep a foothold within it, right? Who can't, you don't have the luxury of being like, oh well, whatever, this is just what I do for a living. But I'm not really defined by my relationship to the university. I think we all are. I think you spend most of your time to work and working. And so yeah, but ultimately, right, these institutions treat people as totally disposable. And that doesn't just go for us, it also goes for our students, and it goes for the communities where they're located, right? Which are pushed out, displaced, policed, what have you. And so I've been trying to think a lot recently about how we kind of like bring those three groups, right? The faculty and staff, the students and the community together around shared struggles. Because I think that historically, like when you look at like where real long-lasting institutional changes taken place, which is more than just like getting a raise in your contract, although I would never, ever talk bad about getting a raise in your contract. It's awesome, love to get a raise. I think that's where, you know, those kinds of like generationally defining struggles can happen. But you know, obviously it's easier said than done, right? Like if we knew it when it came along, we would just be like, okay, great, this is the one, let's go with this. But it's hard, right? It's hard to. So that's what I'll close here and say, like, that's what I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all. Like, where do you see as like the landscape and the terrain, and like what are the struggles that like either are most important to you right now, or that like you see as like having the most potential to like move folks on campus and outside of campus, but like around campus, to a place where like there's a common sense that you know, there's our side and there's the side of the institution. And yeah, I think just, you know, Temple is obviously a place where a lot of that has happened in the last year. In some ways. So yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Happy to talk more about any of that or anything else that you want to hear also about.
Awesome, lots to unpack there. The first thing that jumped out at me in your opening statement, something we've talked a lot about, Debbie is especially interested in the issue of faculty governance and you know, the fight that we've been having, Debbie in particular has been at the forefront of fighting for just basic representation in these institutions, like let's say the Temple Faculty Senate, that are also, and I probably shouldn't be saying this on the record, they're also not noted for having an especially strong, great effect on the actual governance of the university. And so the way you use the idea of democratizing responsibility almost made democracy sound like a slur or something, like democratization here being used as essentially a sort of way of papering over the total lack of accountability and lack of responsibility. And so I think in your remarks, there's one story here about the sort of increasing complexity of the university and the fact that, right, I think in one of your interviews, you talked about how, well, in the old model of faculty governance, essentially faculty were amateurs at running a university. And so everyone, there was this sort of basic equality in the fact that no one had, and a basic democracy too, in the fact that no one was a sort of dedicated administrator.
Right.
And so, I don't know, maybe could we think more about the ways that that has been weaponized? So you wrote about West Virginia and the crisis there, which seems, at least in part, to be a result of this kind of disconnect between the, what's called the professional governing class, like and the actual faculty. And I don't know, could you maybe elaborate on how this situation came to be?
Totally. So there's like a few pieces there, and I'll try to take all of them to the greatest extent that I can. So, you know, one of the things I'll say about West Virginia that is like particularly germane to this audience, and like I'm guilty of it too, right? Like this didn't catch fire until they started firing tenure track faculty, right? That's when this became existential for folks. But when they had laid off 130 staff positions, right? That was, you know, people were upset,
right,
but it wasn't national news. And when they, you know, and that doesn't count. We don't know how many adjuncts or non tenure track people had their contract just not renewed, right? Because that doesn't show up as firing. Right? That just shows up as non-renewals. And so, you know, my guess, right, is that, and so it goes both ways, right? Because on the one hand, when universities start to fire their tenured and tenure track faculty, that's when you know, like, it's really bad, right? Because like they generally don't take that step until they've exhausted all of their other options, right? But what that so there is this sense in which, like, by the time that's happening, they're already selling off, you know, the seats in the movie theater. But on the other hand, there's also the part of it which is like those non-renewals, those firings, those layoffs are so routine that they don't make news, right? Because they're just part of the day in and out of running the business, the university business, where you're just like, all right, well, we have to right size the instructional staff to the offerings, right? And that's like what adjunctification is. It's just in time production of intellectual service, right? It's like the idea that every semester we're going to take a look at what our needs are and employ exactly that amount of people, because there is like a reserve army of labor that just like allows us to always do that, you know. And like, how many of us would sit around for a semester hoping that next semester they pick us back up? Like, not all of us, but like some of us, you know, like a lot of us would be like, all right, well, I'll do something else, right? For a few months, I'll do my research, or I'll drive Uber, or I'll, you know, get a consulting job, or I'll tutor, or I'll, you know, be a writing tutor at a consultant level, right? Like whatever, until they call me back again. And you know, they can do that. It's like, what else are you gonna do? in terms of this governance piece, right, the like democracy stuff, a lot of these institutions of shared governance do descend precisely from that time when universities were governed by amateurs, and there was a sense that like, what is the university? It is the thing that is the collection of its faculty and its students, and that is what the university is. And it makes these decisions together, and it operates, you know, and folks basically run it almost like a club or whatever, right? Where there's somebody whose job it is this year to be in charge of the legal stuff or whatever. And of course, now that ship has long ago sailed because of the complexification. Both, I think, some legitimate and some, you know, bullshit of how hard these institutions are to run, you know.
And I think partly because faculty didn't want to come.
Well, maybe, I think it's tough, right? Because on the one hand, yeah, in many cases, right? On the other hand, there are plenty, you can probably find plenty of cases where folks were just pushed out. On the other hand, like, people probably responded rationally to the diminishment of the powers of these institutions too, where people divested from them because they were like, we can't do anything. And I think that's sort of the lesson there from the organizing point of view, right? Is that your approach to these institutions of shared governance has to be tactical, right? Because what they are ultimately legitimated by the administration's acknowledgement that they're real. And so there are some cases in which, say, getting a seat on the faculty senate might really be a good idea. Or getting the faculty senate to pass a motion, say no conflict, might be a useful exercise. But there's also plenty of cases in which you get routed into the shared governance machine precisely as a way of making you run around in circles, right? And your best alternative is to actually build a parallel structure that is its own legitimation, that says like, we are legitimate because we exist and because more people care about what we do than care about what your bullshit thing does.
Like a union.
Like a union, right? And there, but you know, and not just right, and like that can include like, if we're cut out of budgeting, we're going to do a participatory budgeting process, right? Like everything is an opportunity to show either how strong or how weak you are, right? The more, which is also a risk, right? Because if you set up a parallel institution, but it doesn't have purchase and people don't acknowledge that it's legitimate, then you know you only serve to drive home to your opponent, to your boss, your irrelevance and your inability to move people. And so, you know, we're a little bit far from the original question, but I think I'll just say like all the more reason to be really ruthless in the ways that you assess what you're doing and whether it's working, right? Because it's like the more time you spend doing stuff that doesn't work, the more time you waste and the more people you burn out and frustrate, more conflict amongst yourselves you generate when you want to be generating conflict only with the boss. But it requires like people, it requires a lot of humility to be like, all right, well, that was a flop, you know, let's not try again, but more, let's try something else, right? And it's tough. It's really hard to have those conversations. When people's lives are at stake, like when people's livelihoods are on the line. I don't know any secret for that. You know, it's easy for me to sit here and say it, but like I've been in plenty of groups where we're unable to be really ruthless with ourselves about what's working.
One thing that is important to remember, at least here at Temple, is that we try hard to use the term shared governance, not faculty governance, especially since our union does include librarians and academic professionals, but also what you said about the importance of acknowledging the staff and their commitment also to running this university, and together all of us need to have a voice. Temple's going through this whole presidential search.
Yes.
And they claim that they've listened to everyone's voices and that they have tried on their committee to have faculty voices. One student is represented, one person from the community is represented.
Right, and how many people?
Exactly. There are, I think.
2/3 or something like that.
Pardon?
2/3, well.
Yeah, it's well over half. I think there were 7 of them. or no, I'm on 10 maybe. I think there are 10, and there are 2 faculty members, 1 student, and 1 member of the community. And of the faculty members, of course, they're both tenured, you know, which also cuts out people, and there's no one representing staff. So I think
Yeah, that's why.
the term shared governance is an important one to keep in mind, that all of us together need to find our way back into power.
Totally. No, and that's right, and it, you know, and it's like, well, what's your attitude to what shared government's gonna be? Is it gonna be, like, are you gonna pour your heart and soul into it, knowing that you're structurally gonna be unable to make it function in the way that you want?
Yeah.
On the other hand, you're gonna totally blow it up and give them an excuse to kill whatever vestigial aspects of it still do work. You know, and that's why I think, like, you know, like you ultimately have to have a sort of a tactical relationship to it, where you wanna get somebody on that committee. Because they're ultimately gonna be able to tell you and feed you stuff that you would not otherwise know. And because sometimes it is important to just like have somebody who speaks up, even if they can't win, right, a vote, and say, hey, you know, this is wrong, this is misguided. But on the other hand, right, like you don't wanna put your best leader in there who's like maybe most valuable somewhere else, right, actually generating popular support. You wanna put somebody who, you know, understands the limitations of the role and isn't gonna like go off the deep end when they realize that like the whole thing has been set up to structurally make sure that their vote doesn't count. Right, they have to go in knowing that.
Yeah.
Right, and sometimes just getting somebody on that board is a victory, and sometimes it's like, nah, I don't know, you know, it's.
Yeah.
I think we have some experience with that. We recently were able to have an adjunct council on faculty senate. There hadn't been one previously. And it really was just recently a thing, so not much has been accomplished yet. But I don't know, you know, I think hopefully in the future we'll at least be able to make a point that we're there at
Do
the
you
very,
vote?
very least.
No, we do not.
We do not have the ability to vote now.
So you're like an observer state.
We are
So
quote unquote advisory.
And the committee up until now has been chaired by a tenured faculty member, not by an adjunct.
Yeah, the adjunct.
We're currently in the process of changing that. And yeah, I mean, this is a good example of something that is in a way a sort of quixotic symbolic victory for representation, but on the other hand, I think it really does have real effects, right?
Yeah.
There's the demand for recognition, the demand for, right, some kind of wrestling with the fact of equality. One of the arguments that they've used, and this gets a big problem of governance, especially in the world of contingent faculty. So they've used the argument that basically us serving on committees like this would be unpaid labor, right? That labor is
Right.
part of your contract as a faculty member, part of your service, but we don't have that. But then you're presented with the paradox that you have tenured faculty making decisions about what kind of unpaid labor these contingent faculty should be
you from
doing.
your own desire to self-exploit.
Exactly, it's incredibly paternalistic, the definition of paternalism, but.
Sort of psychological way of hiding the fact that it's absolutely unpaid labor for the full-time faculty also.
Yeah.
But we can hide that all if it's actually about caring about the adjuncts.
Yeah.
Well, so here's my question about the like adjunct advisory council on the faculty senate. What do you remember think about it?
Which members?
Oh, the adjuncts were members of TAUP. How much does it matter to that?
Not a lot.
Probably not a lot.
That's-
I don't think there's
Not a lot.
much change that we can affect.
But the reason it doesn't matter to them is that that committee has of yet has done nothing. If we could get that committee active, which we're hoping to do next year, meeting and coming up with helpful things for adjuncts, then I think will matter.
Yeah.
At this point, it doesn't matter because it's a brand new committee and it's done nothing.
Well, I guess the other question is like, how much do they interact with the faculty senate, right? Like, what's their, do they know, like, does the average adjunct know this?
No.
Probably not. Probably not, or
So
if they do, just barely.
who do they interact with?
They do interact with us with TAB.
Mhm.
because we created Adjunct Commons. So we created a site that all adjuncts are automatically enrolled in. And we can talk to them there and
Yeah.
we can interact with them, and so they do know who we are.
Yeah.
And I at least do get a lot of emails from them,
That's great. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, if you can establish something like that where you're offering, you know. Not to say like you're offering a service, right? Because like you always say, like evening's not a service. Right, but like you are doing in useful ways stuff that nobody else is doing for that. That would make union, right?
Yeah,
What else? What else did you wanna?
Well, I've got a whole slew of
Yeah, let's go.
things that we can talk about. So the relationship between, well, so you were talking earlier about creating a kind of connection between faculty, students, and the community. And so one problem and that would a kind of paradox of higher education right now is the student debt crisis, right? So so they've created this sort of perverse incentive that, right, keeping wages low for adjuncts or contingent faculty is treated essentially as a way to keep tuition lower for students. And so essentially beating us both with the same stick in different rhythms. So I don't know, could you speak to the relationship between those things? How that's come up in other organizing struggles, perhaps?
Totally. And I see Christina commented that she likes that adjunct comments. That's
Oh,
awesome. So yeah, so one of the things, if you've ever read Christopher Newfield, who wrote The Great Mistake, which is about the evisceration of public universities, one of the arguments that he makes that's really interesting, and like I have to say, I haven't exactly like fact checked his sources on this, but I take it on faith because I respect him, and I think he's very smart, is that typically, right, people think what happens is that state funding gets pulled back, and so tuition gets increased to compensate for the lack of state funding. But historically, it's actually in fact the opposite that's happened, right? Tuition was raised by institutions which lawmakers took as proof positive that tuition could be raised, right? Which gave them an opportunity to make cuts. But then you enter into a cut cycle where, right, tuition gets raised to cover cuts and then some, and then new cuts get in, and then you're in this sort of like death spiral. And so it is true that at least part of student debt was a way to discipline students, right? It was a way of punishing them for getting too activist in the 60s and 70s. It was a way of saying we're going to have students have more skin in the game because we don't want them to just go somewhere for 4 years to learn how to be radicals and then, not have any connection to or investment in society as it exists, because then they're going to ask why it has to exist in this way when it is so monstrous. And it's worked, right? It's succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And to me, like as a humanist, right, which I realize not everyone is, in fact, most people aren't. I don't know how we can ask students to pay, to end up with tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt for degrees that they don't know are gonna, give them a financial benefit that's greater than what they spent on them. And it's not to say that like the only reason to go to college or get an education is to make money. I mean, I think there's, I have proof that you never have to do that. But seriously, like, I do think, that as long as students walk in on day one saying, I'm gonna have this thing hang over my head for the rest of my life, it is impossible for them to get a good education, right? It's impossible for them to, and not in the sense that they won't learn, they'll acquire skills, they'll be successful. But like, they can't follow their interests, their passions, the things, like they can't do the things that really call out to them as human beings, which I think is ultimately like what we want for them, right? For them to be able to actually self-actualize, even though, that's a term that is like a little bit treacly, but like, I do think that's like the business we're ultimately in, right? Is giving people the opportunity to become who they want to be. And like, you can't become who you want to be with debt. hanging over you. But also, right, to the extent that student debt crisis is wielded as an opportunity as a stick to hit labor with, right? That's also a mistake, right? And it's the same thing that we're seeing the Republicans do nonstop, saying basically like, oh, college is, I think not entirely successfully because they're not really that committed to the rhetoric, but like, if you watch Republicans debates, which thankfully I don't do, but I've seen the clips, right? They say stuff like college is too expensive, right? People are drowning in debt. And it's because these liberal professors, these leftist professors, they want to charge people to learn about, whatever, woke stuff. And that, right, that is as bad as saying we can't pay you more because we need to control student debt loads. These institutions are massively wealthy, right? I mean, even Temple, which is not exactly, Princeton in terms of its endowment, is building $1 million buildings everywhere you go, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that, we have to go from nobody making a living wage to everybody making 6 figures overnight. But the priorities are completely backwards, and they're chasing this, and this is what happened at West Virginia, right? They're chasing this model of we need to put in our money, we need to invest our money into this tech stuff, or this science stuff, or this business school stuff. Fancy buildings, right? Because ultimately that's how we're gonna get out of the hole, because those are gonna have return on the investment. But there's no proof that's true.
And it didn't work.
It never works. It never works, right? There's another thing that Chris Newfield said to me when we were talking about West Virginia specifically, and I quoted him in my piece saying this, like, you're not going to be the next Silicon Valley. You're not going to be the next Route 128 because those places already exist, right? You can't just be another carbon. Every single city in the country is like, well, I know what we'll do. We'll be a tech and innovation hub. Well, it's like, how many tech and innovation hubs do you need, right? Like, this is Snakeville, and people buy it, right? And it's because it passes as common sense. And so part of the struggle for us as a labor movement, but also I would say as a movement of folks who want a more humane higher education system for us, for our students, for the communities that these institutions occupy. We need to try to substitute our common sense for their common sense, right? Which is a common sense around treating people with dignity as not disposable, paying them fairly for their work, compensating them fairly for the resources that they generate for the institution, and not fleecing them, robbing them blind, and leaving them indebted for the rest of their lives. I don't know how we get there. I think ultimately it does take a much higher level of political coordination and sophistication than we've been capable of, but I know that it doesn't happen from not fighting individual fights too on each of these campuses.
It does seem like a bit of a paradox. So speaking of politics, because so it feels a little like some members of the university community are almost afraid of addressing politics head on for fear of feeding into the rhetoric of the university just being a place for ideological indoctrination, for instance.
Totally.
On the flip side, though, so I also teach at Rutgers in New Jersey, and during their recent organizing, they actually convinced the governor and the state legislators to actually increase the endowment for all of New Jersey's universities.
Yeah.
So they're actually able to pull off the ultimate hat trick. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on the sort of politics of this? One of the ideas in your story on West Virginia that was most striking to me was the fact that the president of the university refused to take the political route in a sense, choosing to rely entirely on market forces to solve the problems of the university, which in turn made the problems worse, which almost seemed like perhaps an deliberate own goal.
No, I mean, my personal theory, I was like, hey, print this. But my personal theory is that there was at least some level of coordination there, right? Between him and the House of Delegates, where the sense was you guys are going to take the hit up front, and once you completed your transformation, the investment will come. Because that's actually what's gone on. What's really interesting, right? And I'll get to your question about New Jersey and politics. in a second, but what's really interesting about, say, if you look at the comparative paths that like Texas, Ohio, and Florida have taken, right? Ohio has been unable to really pass or undertake like a revamping of the higher education system in the way that like the right wing playbook calls for, in part because they've been accompanied with cuts, right? They're like, it's like stick and stick, right? Cuts plus restrictive laws. Whereas what DeSantis has done is he's actually increased money. He's increased investment in higher education, right? So the stick is we limit your ideological or the scope of your ideological freedoms, but we give you money, right? And no administrator is going to say no to that, right? Especially because governors come and go, but budgets, you know, if you get the money, typically you can roll them over, right? So I'm sure there's conversations saying, oh, you know, in a few years, DeSantis will be gone,
Right.
so I'll be back to normal, but that center or that budget line item is going to still be here, and that's great. Texas has done the same thing, right? And they're pairing it with not real robust commitments to like access for like historically underrepresented students, first generation students, immigrants, but like non-negligible, right? Scholarships, like promise scholarships, stuff like that. As long as you go to one of their, you know, ideologically tested schools. And so I think the mistake, it's always a mistake, especially in public higher ed, not to be involved in politics, right? Because that's ultimately your boss. They're the ones who write the check, the governor, the legislature. It also means that, you know, and the reality is that they're gonna call you political indoctrinators no matter what. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be strategic, right? Like, it doesn't mean that you should just say whatever and be like, well, it doesn't matter what I say, because no matter what I do, I'm already indicted in the court of public opinion. Like, it's still possible to be your own worst enemy in that way. But I also think, like, the fact that they're going to accuse you in bad faith of engaging in indoctrination doesn't mean that you have to just completely retreat from the sphere of politics, because then you're just leaving the battlefield. Like, the flip side of this, though, is that because, you know, in a private institution, it's easy, right? You know, your boss is the same one person who writes the checks, right? You just beat them up until they give you the money. You just shake them until the money comes out. And then you win, and you go back to your members and say, look at us, you know, what? You guys don't have that, right? Because the person that you have to shake until the money comes out is like 5 rungs above president in the food chain, which also means that you need, you know, more allies who are often going to have their own political agendas and who are going to be more politically, sometimes more politically savvy, in other ways more politically reticent, and you're going to be one thing, right? That they ultimately, you're going to be one thing on their plate, right? So like, when you go to the AFL and you say, hey, AFL, or hey, AFT, or hey, you know, whatever state level affiliate, we need you to use your lobbyist to get us more money in the budget. Then they add it to their list of 40 things that they want more money for, right? And when it comes down to past the budget time, they sit down and they say, all right, well, which 5 of these 40 things do you really want? Unless you guys have the political power, you know, that doesn't happen. And so you have to be like, and it's exhausting, because when you really think about like it, the scope of it, you're like, oh, you know, I should just go work. I don't know. Like, all you can do is like hope to build something that is bigger than you, that will last longer than your time doing it, and that will like accumulate energy and power. And hope, you know, that like we really are in this moment where things change quickly, like what seems to be happening with the UAW, right? Where like, after how many elections that they lost in the South at places like Volkswagen, they seem to have gotten, you know, close to a majority of people signing cards in a week, right? And I think we're not far from something like that. I think it just takes something to really like catch fire. But I think we're close. And that's not to do with anything that like individuals are doing. It's just like people fed up.
Another idea that jumped out at me in the West Virginia piece was, so you talked about connections between the activists at the university and the
Oh, yeah.
teacher strikes, it got a lot of attention, and so in thinking about, so we've been talking a lot about, so we had Brian Sachs and Todd Wilson recently come over from Rutgers and talk to us,
Nice.
and right, we try to talk about building these connections, of course, within the university community, right? One of the reasons why Rutgers was so successful is because they built connections not just within the union, but across, right, all over the campus, and so I don't know, could you speak to connections being made across, like, so you were talking about the UAW strikes and connections building on the successes in different sectors and ways of building a sense of community and common folk.
I mean, I think part of it, right, is like the resonance between the resonance between the West Virginia student demos and the like Red for Ed strikes was not something anybody planned. You know, that was like because it was in the sort of like collective memory of these students who were probably like in middle school or high school, right, when those strikes happened. And so they witnessed that, but it was like part of the language that they knew to draw on to articulate like their position and struggle. I wonder what that like equivalent would be for us. Like here either in Philly or like in Northeast or like in like TAP is an AFT affiliate, right? AFT.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, like or an AFT or what have you. But I do think that like as these fights become more frequent and winning become more common, like they will continue to have they will continue to like speak in a way that like people understand more readily. I do think that like the community piece is the hardest part, right? Because that's the part that we, even as faculty, are like most systematically cut off from. Because the university constructs itself as an armed camp, as like a walled fortress, right? An island, right?
And sometimes when you're talking about real estate, sometimes has an antagonistic relationship to the.
Oh, completely, right? And
Neighborhood around it.
And yeah, and so like we have no legitimacy among community members because they're like, you're just a representative of this thing that like makes my life miserable. And, you know, and so I think that to the extent that like you can build trust, you know, you can begin to think about like, well, we actually are both being victimized by this institution in ways that are not the same, right, but have commonalities. But I also think like just like any process of trust building, it takes a long time, and there are going to be false steps, and like you have to be willing to like be humbled and like make mistakes and show up. And that's I think true in any sort of like process of like growing, right? Like if you're only in rooms where you're totally comfortable, your rooms are too small, right? Like you don't have like you're not really working in coalition, right? You're just working with yourself. I'm seeing some messages over there. I'm wondering what folks are saying.
So yeah.
Oh, sorry, Paul.
Turn the mic
Please
up.
can hear us.
Hopefully that's better.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's what I would say about it. Just that, like, you know, I thought the UIC professor strike last year was interesting. They went, you know, their faculty went on strike, and similarly, I think they are wall to wall. They have, you know, non-tenure track and tenure track faculty, and they, you know, they learned a lot from the Chicago Teachers Union because they're in the same city and they're both AFT locals. And so, you know, they had CTU members like out on the lines, talking, making the connections.
Yeah, that helps.
Right, between like why this struggle in public higher education connects to this larger thing, right, which is about whether people who go to public schools, especially in big cities, deserve the right to a real education. Whether they're just hold themselves before they get put, you know, into like whatever the next like part of the machine is that grinds them up. And I think that narrative has broken through, right? Most people support teacher unions. Most people support at least the idea of making education better. If they don't necessarily support if they don't always agree on what that looks like, right? But you know, I think that and I think in public higher ed, you have an opportunity to like say like we're part of the same system, right? Like the same kids who go to public schools go to public colleges and universities, right?
But there's this misunderstanding.
Mm.
The public in general sees teachers as downtrodden and they don't earn enough money and stuff, but not professors.
True.
They have this idea that professors are rich, which is total BS. But the general public would be shocked to know that a professor earns much, much less than a plumber.
Yeah.
You know, but they wouldn't be shocked to think that of a sixth grade teacher.
No,
They
and-
feel sorry for the sixth grade teacher, but they don't have that kind of a support for higher ed.
Well, and a lot of professors are less than sixth grade teachers too, right?
All right.
Absolutely, most of us, most of the contingent.
Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there's like the narrative piece of that where it's just like a public relations, a communications issue, right? Getting people to be aware of like what the reality of your working conditions are and what the reality of being contingent or adjunct is.
Yeah.
You know, and that can be done through smart communications campaign, right? Like
It's hard to get the professors to talk because
Well,
it's embarrassing.
that's what I was about to say.
Yeah.
But in order to pull that off, right, you have to have the basic level of organization within the unit first, right? Which is like a large number of people who support whatever it is the union's doing, right? Because you don't just run a public awareness campaign around nothing, you run it in the service of some goal, right? Whether it's a contract or a raise or you know, fighting cuts or whatever, right? So it has to be like people support the campaign, people support the union's vision for the campaign, then you can push people past those barriers, right? Well, I'm embarrassed. Okay, well, are you so embarrassed to be in the paper about how little you make that you're willing to forego this raise or you're willing to lose this contract over it? Or are you gonna suck it up and do it for your friends and your colleagues?
Yeah.
Right, and it's not nice, but like, the reality, right, just like I was saying with like working coalition is like, when you are like pushing people to like do stuff in campaigns, you should always be kind of asking them to do one more thing than they would be voluntarily doing just on their own.
Yeah.
Right, because people always are like, I don't have time, not interested, it's risky, get somebody else, and it's, you know.
Yeah.
But they have to be bought in first to the idea that this is valuable, people don't sacrifice for stuff that they don't really care about.
We're gonna do that. Well, how about we pause the recording and then we can switch to a more informal discussion and.
Yeah, I wanna
the
hear-
Visitors should feel free to speak up if you have any questions or comments.